Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I am Lynn Bergeson. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Molly Blessing, Vice President of Sustainability and Product Stewardship at the Household and Commercial Products Association. We discuss a few of the fascinating and vexing challenges industry faces today in the surprisingly complex world of product stewardship. We address, for example, the growing pains of conflicting state extended producer responsibility laws, the challenges in California of labeling a product as recyclable, and making the case for a robust corporate product stewardship program. Now, here is my conversation with Molly Blessing. Molly, I'm so happy that we are having an opportunity to speak today. Welcome.
Thanks, Lynn. Glad to be here.
Well, I know a little bit about you, Molly. We were fortunate enough to have you here as a intern a number of years ago, but perhaps for the benefit of our listeners, you can tell them a little bit about yourself, your multiple graduate degrees, your amazing accomplishments to date, and your position at HCPA.
Sure. I guess in short, I'm a chemist that really has always loved policy and believes that when done well, it can drive positive, lasting change. And so I started off in traditional lab work. As you know, Lynn, started off in the world of chemistry fully and have kind of been increasingly shifting to get to this place where I am now, where I'm leading sustainability and product stewardship, but also very involved in shaping the policy that guides our industry. So I started off at EPA and also served as an AmeriCorps volunteer. So I came from, the government and the nonprofit world, but I've spent the bulk of my career in the private sector. And I feel like that has been what's allowed me to work with companies and with brands directly to help them understand, what do they need to do to move forward on sustainability, and how can they themselves implement those processes within their companies to get to a place where they're putting better products in the market, but also maintaining their own economic value and really seeing business success from that. So at HCPA, this has been kind of the most policy-oriented job I've had. I started off in a law firm consulting firm, segued over to a big major consumer goods and adhesives brand, and now made this jump to a policy-driven trade association. And it's definitely been different, but it's been much more impactful being able to work with companies across an industry as opposed to just, a single company or perhaps very specific clients. And here at HCPA as well, this is the first time that this particular trade association has had a sustainability role. And so it's been an opportunity to build out what sustainability looks like for my industry segment. And I should say a little bit about HCPA just for our listeners.
No, that'd be great.
It's the Household and Commercial Products Trade Association. So we represent chemical products that are used in homes and commercial environments, things like offices, hospitals, schools. We clean, protect, maintain, and disinfect. So basically anything under your kitchen or your bathroom sink is kind of how we describe it.
Well, you note that before you joined HCPA and are happily building out a very, very robust and successful product stewardship program, you did work a bit at EPA in the green chemistry program, where I think you met our very own Dr. Rich Engler. Rich is very passionate about green chemistry, and I sense that you are also. When did the green chemistry bug bite you? You probably did so at an early age, and you've taken that interest and that passion and rolled it up and are now doing fabulous work at HCPA. What motivated you down this course?
Well, I suppose my first confession here is I was never particularly interested in chemistry until about my senior year of high school.
I won't tell Rich that.
I was a huge reader as a kid, and like I said, fascinated by policy, but also by science and mysteries and stories of how science can be used to unravel mysteries. And so, when my senior year of high school, I picked up this book by Deborah Blum. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist. Highly recommend her as an author. And specifically, I picked up the Poisoner's Handbook. And the Poisoner's Handbook is, it's a nonfiction. It's about the birth of forensic chemistry, actually, in the U.S., but it's told like a science thriller. So for me at 17, I was like, wow, this is really fascinating. Let me dig into this. And it's all about how common household products were full of incredibly toxic chemicals, morphine, thallium, radium, and people were using them to effectively murder each other, commit crimes. And
Jeez.
and
Is that
this
all?
went on. Yeah. This went on for decades, and then it really changed when New York City finally put in place a medical examiner that was scientifically trained, and he hired a well-trained toxicologist, and together they developed out the science of forensic chemistry, figured out how to understand and prevent these crimes from happening, and really put in place standards that were applicable to the rest of the country. But that was for me kind of an eye-opening book because, well, first of all, it was the first time I really thought about how much chemistry was in our everyday products. I don't think that's something that really occurs to most people, that every household product you use is made up of a bunch of chemicals. Even water is a chemical. And all of those things combined is what enables our quality of life today. And if you use, better chemistry, safer chemistries, you can put really effective products in the market that also enhance our quality of life and protect our health and the environment. And if there's more toxic things in there, the opposite is true. And I'd really never conceptualized how much chemistry can have an impact on both our health and also the health of the environment until I really read that book. So that was sort of what intrigued me to begin with. And the other thing that stood out to me was that these while it was excellent that the science was developed to catch and prevent these crimes, what was really needed was a standard policy too, like a baseline floor for product safety, because then you wouldn't need to be chasing down and testing every single individual product like that. If you had that kind of baseline policy in place, that would help make sure that everything on the market was standardized, safe for use, safe for its intended use. And then the science could focus on maybe developing out more enhanced products as opposed to catching and preventing crimes committed with the toxic stuff that was
Right.
currently on the market. So, yeah, I think that book was really, for me, just kind of the big moment that changed the way I thought about chemistry and the way I thought about what it could do. And so I decided I wanted to study chemistry. And then I went to college and I went to University of Connecticut, great school, great chemistry program. And I was fortunate enough to have access to a green chemistry professor at UConn, Dr. Nicholas Ledbeater, or Dr. L, as we call him in the lab. And I joined his research group very early on. I walked into his office and I said the words policy, environment, and chemistry. And he was like, I have just the project for you. And that was
It's
that.
love at first sight, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then the third thing I would say is I also managed to get very involved with the American Chemical Society when I was in college. And also via doing that internship at EPA that you referred to, went to my first ACS Green Chemistry Institute conference. And for me, that was really, I think, what formalized my understanding and love for green chemistry, is seeing this whole community of scientists that have all built their careers around and are really engaged.
Well, I'll have to suggest that book to as required reading for our new members at the Product Stewardship Society. I had no idea that that was so influential in your experience.
I will say Deborah Blum also has a similar one that she wrote several years later about the FDA called The Poison Squad, the birth of the FDA and food safety. Sometimes I
Okay.
wonder, like, what if I'd read that one? Would I be in the food industry right
Right,
now?
you
But
might be working for the FDA right now. Well,
yeah.
but collectively, how has your work experience? You've been in private practice, at a law firm, at this law firm, you've worked for EPA, you worked for a major industrial adhesives company. How has that experience informed your approach to addressing product stewardship issues, and how do you deploy that with regard to your membership at HCPA?
So I think one thing that's been consistent across all of these areas is that product stewardship involves more than one team. You might have one person who's the organizer of product stewardship efforts and initiatives, but product stewardship at the core is about thinking about the whole life cycle of a product and its packaging and their impacts. And no one team can do that alone. And so, what I've always felt is very important is making sure that even if, for example, at HCPA, I have ownership of product stewardship, that I engage with other teams within HCPA, but also with my member companies, that I make sure to give a pathway for their government relations teams, their regulatory teams, even their procurement or their marketing teams to get involved and hear their perspectives and make sure they feel they have a path too to contribute to what our industry is doing or what their company is doing on moving product stewardship initiatives forward. I think the last thing I want to do is be working in a vacuum or have another team be contradicting what we're doing over here.
No, that is so true. It involves a number of disciplines, perspectives, and it really does take a village to deploy everything to unlock true product stewardship for companies and organizations. So that's very, very wise on your part, Molly. One thing that I know has always fascinated me is kind of the business proposition for product stewardship. As a former president of the Product Stewardship Society and a member of its board for many years, I was always challenged to make the kind of business proposition for company executives, like, why should I invest resources in a product stewardship program for my company? Maybe you can help us understand what your thinking is in that regard on what is the business case for companies and why do they need and why would they be better off with the product stewardship component in their business operations?
Yeah, I think we're increasingly seeing consumers and policymakers attempting to hold brands accountable, particularly not just brands, but particularly brands because they're so visible
Mhm.
in the marketplace, holding them accountable for what goes on with their products at all levels of the supply chain. So that might include where their raw materials are sourced from, where their ingredients come from, how they're made, whether they use animal testing to assess safety. It can also include the way the packaging is disposed of or the product is disposed of at end of life. We're seeing litigation about recyclable claims in particular really on the rise. We're seeing policy programs like this new movement in the US of packaging extended producer responsibility, really requiring brands to collect information about packaging from their supply chain, report that information, make design changes, and pay fees on that information, uh, holding them accountable in ways that have really never happened in the past. And companies that don't have a product stewardship component in place, they simply do not have the supply chain connections and information and action plans to respond to these asks. So I think it's really essential for anybody seeking to do business today to have that product stewardship component to make sure they build out those supply chain connections, they have that information, and they're prepared to drive changes throughout to respond to this new wave of expectations that we're seeing today.
Completely agree. One of the topics you just mentioned is extended producer responsibility, which is a huge topic right now in it for a lot of different reasons that I'd like to explore with you. At least the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, defines EPR as a policy approach, a group of economic instruments that raise revenue and set incentives for the collection and recovery of material at the post-consumer stage of the product life cycle. We are seeing an increase for sure in the United States of EPR programs being developed at the state level, which is really, really good. I mean, I'm a huge supporter of extended producer responsibility because it does tend to generate revenue, much needed revenue to address products and packaging at the end of life stage, shifting it away from municipal coffers onto private interests. One of the many issues that we've been struggling with, though, are the differences across timelines and scope and many of the key features of these programs. There are common elements, single producer responsibility organizations to manage governance, assessment of fees, operation of the program, establish fee schedules based on weight and recyclability, have certain auditing and reporting obligations. So there's a lot that is common to EPR programs, but there's a great deal of variation between and among the states. Can you walk us through, for our listeners' benefit, what is a typical EPR program?
Sure, I'll try. I will say, I don't think any of the US EPR programs are really what's considered typical by a global
A
standard.
good point,
Um,
right.
if you think about it at a very high level, what is EPR and how does that translate? EPR at the core, as you said, is shifting financial responsibility from the municipal government for recycling systems and packaging disposal and putting that onto the producers, which is generally defined as the brand owner who sells products in that packaging. And then what we've seen in the US is also all of the EPR programs for packaging here include what we call eco-modulation, which is a financial incentive that encourages companies to design their packaging in ways that supports increased circularity, improved environmental health outcomes, or other sustainability factors. So that's kind of at a high level of the goals of an EPR program. How we've seen that kind of manifest itself in practice for what the producers need to do in the US. Because they're all based on financial responsibility, there's going to be fees associated with that. So every EPR program has a fee schedule, and the requirement is that companies will pay fees in accordance with that fee schedule. Every EPR program also requires reporting of producers' supply into the marketplace, and what type of material they're supplying. And that's to ensure that the fees assigned are fair and equitable, that they're related to the amount of packaging that the producer is putting into the state that then needs to be managed and handled. So you have this reporting obligation, you have this fee obligation, and after that, it does tend to get a bit of like the Wild West. You know, I think the original intent was to have a single producer responsibility organization, but we're already seeing smaller organizations sort of shoot up and try and take over some obligations as well, or responsibilities for certain material types. So even the hope of a single PRO, a single organization to do this reporting and fee payment, that may or may not really play out in practice. States have defined the actual ways you need to report very differently. States have designed the incentives, the types of uh, things that they want producers to do to improve the circularity of their packaging very differently. So eco-modulation is not consistent from state to state. It really makes it very difficult to comply. And so, from a simplified perspective, what we tend to tell companies is, look, the biggest thing that affects what fees you pay is whether or not your packaging is recyclable. Because in all of the states, it's the recyclability of your packaging that determines your base fee. Everything else is going to be a modification to that base fee. But if you're starting from a good place, that puts you in a much more advantageous position overall than if you start from a bad place and try to tack on some other eco-modulation incentive. So let's start by trying to make your packaging as recyclable as possible. That will get you to the lowest level of base fee, and then you can worry about these other, nice to have add-ons.
That's good advice, and that's one of the, I think, policy goals of an EPR program. If you incentivize product manufacturers to choose products or make products in a way that enhances recyclability, ultimately you're going to be paying a lot less. One of the issues that I wanted to raise with you, and for the benefit of our listeners, is a very significant legal challenge to the Oregon EPR statute, the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. It was enacted in 2021 and just very recently has endured some legal scrutiny. As a lawyer, and as a practitioner working with companies that have to live by these EPR statutes, I appreciate the challenges of trying to anticipate what a fee assessment might be, how each state that has an EPR program might go about the business of defining what is recyclable and establishing an appropriate fee schedule and the cadence of fee payments. And some of those issues are exactly what is at issue in National Association of Wholesaler Distributors, which is a district court in the Federal District Court of Oregon that is challenging both the operational aspects of the Oregon EPR program and some of the underlying principles. And it's a much-watched case, as I'm sure many of your members, Volley, have witnessed. The bottom line challenge brought by the plaintiffs is that there is undue burden on interstate commerce in violation of the Due Process Clause under the 14th Amendment. There are various procedural and substantive issues being addressed in the case. And this past February, the plaintiffs were successful in procuring a injunction with regard to the effectiveness of the Oregon statute with regard to the members of the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors. So with regard to members only, the Oregon statute does not or is not enforced against them, but it is certainly enforceable with regard to everyone else, as a number of additional challenges to the statute has made clear. The court, at least based on my reading, found that there are a number of very significant constitutional questions raised by the Oregon EPR and found a probable likelihood of success on the merits with regard to the case, which is, of course, one of the foundational principles of procuring injunctive relief. I know HCPA is not involved in the case and is probably not taking a position on it, but what is interesting to me is how is HCPA preparing and educating its members and perhaps the public at large about EPR laws, and how is HCPA supporting its members right now in addressing the uncertainty and the opacity and alleged lack of transparency with regard to establishing what is recyclable and what fee ought to attach. It is, to use your language, kind of the wild, wild west out there. And there's a great deal of discussion about how can the business community adjust to an increasingly speculative and uncertain future with regard to the fees that are being asked of members that are subject to EPR laws, without knowing exactly how they are derived and how they might ultimately prepare their business operations for these fees, which in many cases, as you know well, Molly, are not insubstantial.
Yeah, in many cases, they're very significant. I mean, there's a real fear that EPR might put companies out of business for being unable or to budget for these fees, not knowing what's coming, particularly smaller to mid-sized companies that just did not ever see this coming down the pipeline, don't sell globally.
Right.
Um, so no, this is a very real concern for even some of our members. And then we also have members that help to stand up Circular Action Alliance, the producer responsibility organization that's been selected in all of the EPR states that to date have selected a PRO. And we even have members that help stand up the Lubricant Packaging Management Association, which is a
Mhm.
smaller,
Right.
additional type of PRO for very specific types of automotive products. So at HCPA overall, there is and has been member support for EPR when done well, but to date, none of these EPR programs appear to have reached the policy principles that we laid out for ourselves and our industry back in 2022. So, in terms of how do we prepare, so HCPA, I should probably mention, in addition to formulated products, we also represent aerosols. So we actually have a packaging material type that is within our product scope. And because of that aerosol segment of our membership, we've engaged with stakeholders on recycling for quite some time, even
Mhm.
before EPR really started taking off. So NGOs like the Recycling Partnership, How to Recycle, which is a consumer education labeling system, the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, and then also policymakers to support increased aerosol recycling. And so we had those relationships in place to some degree, and we've been able to leverage that to have really thoughtful conversations about how not just aerosols, but the other product types that we represent, how those materials should be considered, particularly for our industry segment where the formulation itself can impact whether or not the packaging material is considered recyclable at end of life. That's a real nuanced and complicated conversation to have, particularly since most people in the waste management system and working on recycling are not chemists and don't really understand the difference between this or that formulation or what impacts it might have. And so HCPA really needs to be present at the table, and we've really tried to be to make sure that we're carving out a path for our membership to be considered recyclable. And we've seen some success. For example, in Oregon, we were able to make the case that antimicrobial pesticide products can be recycled just like a normal cleaner that doesn't have that disinfectant ingredient. And as a result, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is going to propose including that in an update to the EPR program in a forthcoming rule to be released this fall.
Well,
So
that's
there's
great. I did
yeah.
not so what is the existing provision that products that contain antimicrobials are somehow treated differently from non-treated
So the
products?
existing provision is that anything registered as a pesticide product in the U.S. is not recyclable. It's very broad, and it does not take into account, right, the disinfectants and sanitizers that you might use to spray your counter or your floor, that those things are really effectively a cleaning product with one additional ingredient, and that additional ingredient does not have any impact on recyclability. And so in order to get there, we also had to have a really serious conversations with the Association of Plastic Recyclers, which has been, I think, very productive overall in helping us as an industry understand, like, what are the challenges to recycling our products and where are opportunities for us to be very clearer in collaboration with APR about what should and should not be going into the bin.
That's super, that's excellent.
And I should say one thing too on the back to the fees piece though, because this gets us far, right? For the products that can be considered recyclable, but then what about the ones that aren't? I
Right.
mean, you're going to have extremely high fees, and even when you are recyclable, you're still paying fees. You need to have some understanding of what those fees are going to be. So we try to exchange work very closely with Circular Action Alliance. We participate in regular calls with them. We try to elevate member concerns. We also try to translate information from CAA
Hmm.
so that it reaches members in a simplified fashion and in a way that's business friendly. So, for example, we've been taking the information coming out of CAA and developing out a fee schedule for our members that at least gives them an estimate of what year they're going to have to pay each fee. And to the degree that we have more information, perhaps even what month, what type of fee it is. Is it going to be, a pre-program early fee, which is going to be much lower? Is it going to be an implementation fee, much higher on the scale of
Hmm.
Oregon? So we try to translate information like that, help companies budget, help them think through these things, recognizing that CAA is doing a lot here, but they're one organization. They're a nonprofit, and they're trying to be good stewards of the money that companies are paying and, channeling that into the recycling system and the things they're required to do. But as a result, they're perhaps not as able to make business-friendly communications that lay out exactly what needs to be done and help the business at a very high level make some of the financial decisions that need to be made to prepare for EPR. So that's where HCPA tries to fill in a gap here. And again, also elevating concerns. We had issues, for example, with companies not being able to see financial information in their producer portal. And so that needs to change, right? You need to be able to see what you've submitted, have a record of that. Um, and also, ideally, have some advance notice of what you're going to pay before you receive that invoice in the mail. And so we've been able to take issues like that, and we're seeing them get worked through to be resolved.
Well, and some of those issues are exactly the issues that we here at the law firm are beginning to see raised routinely by our clients, perhaps entities that are not members of HCPA or other trade associations that are perhaps more familiar with some of these lack of transparency issues. How are fees calculated? When might they be expected? How is recyclability defined? In that you have programs now in California, Oregon, Colorado, Maine, Minnesota, Maryland, and Washington State. There's understandably an uptick in interest and concern in these areas. I know you work so hard and so well and so ably, Molly, for HCPA member companies. Do you have general guidance for companies that are not members of your trade association on how they might prepare for this growing patchwork of state EPR programs that are similar in structure, but quite different with regard to operational integrity, deadlines, fee structure, and so forth? There's no how-to manual out there, and yet I see this as a huge issue that is ultimately going to be affecting just about every manufacturer in the United States.
Yeah, there's no how-to manual, and I should say, HCPA has not solved this issue for our members. We're just trying to make sense of it for them, and I think that our members, as a result, are further along, but no one's got this perfectly resolved. Even our members that are board members of PROs are still struggling with this.
Yep.
And so one of the things that we've actually found really valuable at HCPA is making working groups where members can talk to each other and just exchange stories, exchange lessons learned. Maybe if someone got an answer from CAA that's applicable to the whole group. And so that would be my first piece of advice. Even if, you're not a member of a trade association that has that type of forum, try to seek out a conference that maybe is packaging focused or has CAA in attendance, somewhere where you're going to be able to network with a lot of other companies that might be working through these same types of issues and try to connect with them because EPR is a shared challenge. And perhaps they're going to have some suggestions. You're going to make some connections that might let you move forward on this, even if your trade association doesn't have that specific type of forum.
That's
And there's some
good
overall. Oh, sorry. Go
advice.
ahead, Lynn.
No, 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 it's just very good advice, yeah, but I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue.
No, I was going to say there's some overall things too that we always tell people. A couple of years ago, we had a consultant develop out kind of an EPR readiness checklist for our members that really just has some base level concepts, but I think that's been valuable for them in thinking about how to work through this. And so the first piece is just identifying an owner for EPR. And that sounds simple, but it's really not. This is a new type of policy. It has implications for financial stuff, for sustainability, for packaging engineering, for regulatory compliance, for legal. So how do you take all of that and figure out who that owner is, it can be hard, but it is something that's very important to have in place before anything else is done, just for general organization. And then budgeting. You might not know what the fees are, but as a worst case, you can look at Oregon year two and just apply that everywhere else. And if you have that as a starting point, it's always easier to say, oh, by the way, I don't need to spend this than it is to try to find money that you didn't already budget for. And at the very least, having those conversations with your financial department is early on is going to be very important for when you do perhaps need to be scrambling for money for some fees later on that you didn't realize were going to be coming. If you have that relationship with them and they know it's already perhaps going to be an ask at some point in the future, that's going to make it much easier to pay those fees on time than if they had never heard of EPR until the bill arrived. The third thing we say is just collect and curate data.
Right. B and your suggestion of trying to look to see what these fee structures might be or how they've been applied, at least in Oregon for the last couple of years, would be a helpful tutorial in preparing for fee schedules around the United States under other programs. I'm guessing you're watching pretty carefully the court in National Association of Wholesaler Distributors, since the core of the case relates to the constitutionality of some of these approaches to implementing EPR. I know I listened to a podcast on the case a number of weeks ago, and to some extent, what goes on in Oregon could have a ripple effect on EPR programs throughout the United States. Is that a fair statement?
Yes and no. Eh, Oregon's EPR program certainly shares similarities with many other programs in the US, but there's also some substantive differences.
Mhm.
Oregon's program has been very reluctant to exempt any materials. For example, we typically see materials that are particularly highly federally regulated or might pose health challenges if they go through the recycling system. We usually see those materials exempted out. And Oregon has been very reluctant to exempt anything. And that has led to concerns about what this might mean for the price of goods in Oregon. If things are just innately always going to be classified as not recyclable and paying higher fees into the system because they're unable to make the packaging changes that are needed to be recyclable, that is almost certainly going to drive up the price of those types of goods. And some of these things are really essential. Some of these things might be food. Sometimes you just really need uh, a very high strength corrosive drain cleaner. I mean, there are some of the times you really just need this type of product. And if you don't have
Sure.
another option out there, um, you're perhaps being priced out of some of the goods you rely on. So that's a concern in Oregon that I don't think we quite see in those other states that have more exemptions in place. And then Oregon too, just there's certain materials like garbage bags, for example, that are in scope of Oregon. I mean, I don't think most people consider garbage bags packaging. But even
No,
that
I
is something
don't.
that's paying fees in Oregon right now, and is
Right.
probably going to be paying fees forever because garbage bags are not supposed to be recyclable. That's
Exactly.
not the point of them. So there's just some parts about Oregon's program that make it very difficult to deal with, and there's some very stringent requirements for things like responsible end markets, for example, that I know have been challenging for CAA to implement in practice. And so, depending on what pieces of Oregon's program the judge finds are problematic, this may or may not have substantive implications for the other states. But I think if the PRO pieces go through, that would have implications for all of the other states because CAA is the PRO and they're operating in a very similar fashion in all of the
Right.
packaging EPR states to date. So, whatever is found in Oregon related to the PRO and its fees, I would think would apply to other states as well.
For our listeners, again, that's the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors. I think there's going to be a 5-day trial this July, so there could be a decision out later this year. Very interesting case that will have implications for some other programs. But to your point, Molly, there are unique aspects of the program that are unlikely to have resonance, beyond Oregon. Let's touch upon another really important stewardship issue relating to recyclable claims. You had mentioned this in your opening remarks. For many, many years, product manufacturers have been encouraged to recycle products and recycle packaging by labeling them with terms like recyclable or using phrases or instructions like please recycle, or through the use of iconography like the chasing arrow signs that we're all very, very familiar with. There's a provision in California called SB 343 that prohibits businesses from using these words, cues, and symbols on products unless certain state criteria are met that, to some anyway, are thought to be both very unclear and difficult to understand and very difficult to implement. I'm not going to go into all of the particulars there, but it's important to know that last month the coalition of industry groups sued the state, challenging SB 343, arguing that it violates First Amendment free speech rights and is therefore unconstitutional. The case is California League of Food Producers v. Banta and was filed in the Federal District Court for the Southern District of California. Now, what's important for our listeners is that the deadline for implementation of the act is October 4, 2026, which for many of us is like very, very soon approaching. And after that date, businesses would be prohibited from displaying any symbol or statement indicating a product or packaging is recyclable unless it is deemed recyclable in the state, consistent with the provisions of SB 343. That's one challenge to the use of the term recyclable on products and packaging. There are lots and lots of others. Greenwashing claims, for example, claiming that something is recyclable when in fact it may not be. Allegations of deceptive trade practices in violation of state consumer product laws. For product manufacturers like HCPA members, there are a lot of different challenges out there, and it's at a very interesting and evolving space regarding what is recyclable, both for the reasons that we've talked about under the EPR laws and now this California issue. HCPA does a fabulous job of educating its members and the public at large on some of these issues, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what your specific role is in educating, advising entities on how to deal with these issues, and also informing regulatory approaches to defining what is recyclable.
Sure. So I'll start with aerosols because since that's the packaging horn that we represent, that's where we've done by far the most work. Recyclability has been a big focus of our aerosol division for a long time, in part because it's very difficult to make a reusable aerosol. By its nature, aerosol is a propellant system. It's pressurized. Very, very difficult to design that to support reuse or refill. So if you think about the waste management hierarchy, yes, reuse is preferred, but if you can't achieve reuse, what's the next most preferred option? It's recycling. And so we've been very focused on how do we make that aerosol can recyclable? How do we ensure that it is in fact recycled in practice? And aerosols are almost entirely made up of steel and aluminum. So 98% of aerosols on the market are either steel or aluminum. They're highly valuable metals,
Mm-hmm.
can easily be recovered through existing systems, don't need special processing. And so we think there's a real opportunity here if aerosols are marked as recyclable to get that metal back. So we've engaged throughout the system. We've been talking to MRFs, material recovery facilities. Those are the uh, facilities that collect and sort and process materials for recycling. We've talked to end markets. Those would be the metal smelters, for example, that would take or buy the recycled steel or aluminum from the MRF and then remelt that to make new products.
Mm-hmm.
And we've also talked to the local governments about collection, the type of education and outreach that they're putting out to understand, are there barriers? And if there are barriers to aerosol recycling, what can we do to address those? And we determined through all of this engagement that the real barrier is that initial collection point and safety concerns about potentially collecting and processing a container that has residual pressure.
Interesting.
So we've really focused our aerosol recycling efforts on education and outreach to make sure consumers know to empty the can. And simultaneously, we've explored fire safety testing. We've looked at risk assessments. We've looked at what might need to be done to improve MRF's setup so that they have the systems in place to feel confident in accepting more materials. And we've done a lot on consumer education about how to empty the aerosol can and the importance of emptying the aerosol can. We're actually running a pilot program right now in Portland, Oregon, in conjunction with Circle Action Alliance and some of the local governments out there that has this very consumer facing messaging about, again, the importance of emptying the can and 3 steps for how to do it: press it, shake it, recycle it.
Hmm.
And so we're testing the can residue and before and after we do that campaign. So we did a before test already. We'll do an after one to see, has it substantively decreased? Has there been success with our messaging? Do we need to tweak something or rerun it again? And we're looking to do that same type of project in other areas like Florida as well.
Hmm.
Um,
It's a
so
terrific idea.
yeah, that's on aerosols education. And then we also simultaneously have recently formed an aerosol design for recycling group. Because yes, that metal is highly recyclable, but perhaps there's things we can do to make it a little bit easier. Maybe we use less plastic as an inner component of the aerosol. That plastic burns off in the um, recycling process, but ideally, there would be less of it because when you burn off the plastic, that does change the temperature of the recycling process, and perhaps that's not ideal, particularly for something that's very sensitive like aluminum. So we're looking at, are there ways to redesign the aerosol so that it's perhaps more of that valuable metal, a little bit less plastic items that might impact the temperature of the remelt process in ways that end markets don't want. And then we've kind of taken the relationships we've built for aerosols and expanded that to start having conversations very recently about our formulated products more broadly and the way that residue might or might not impact the recyclability of the packaging. So we're working with How to Recycle, the consumer education label, and the Association of Plastic Recyclers to really take a much closer look at our different product categories and say what's okay for the recycling system residue wise, what's not, and why isn't it okay? And is there something we can do about that or a way we can very clearly identify that so that consumers are not confused when they're looking at
Hmm.
their product and trying to figure out what to do with it at the end of the day?
Those are terrific ideas. And a question our listeners might be asking is, are some of these, your aerosol education program, are materials available on your website if they wish to learn more about that?
Yeah, we have a whole page on our website dedicated to our aerosol recycling initiative. So we do our aerosol recycling work in partnership with the Can Manufacturers Institute, our
Hmm.
allied trade who makes metal cans. And I should say that's supported by almost 20 companies across the aerosol value chain. So this is really industry funded in addition to the fees that they pay to HCPA and CMI as part of membership. This is a passion project for many of them. And we have a page on our website that's dedicated to the aerosol recycling initiative, which has our white paper from 2024, all of our graphics, more recent information about what we're doing, a recently published MRF playbook, Material Recovery Facility playbook, that talks about strategies and suggestions for recycling facilities looking to recover more aerosols, like what are challenges they might face and what might they do to be able to successfully and safely um, take in more aerosols. So all of that's on our website. You can just Google House and Commercial Products Association and then click over to the aerosol section of our webpage and it's there.
Great. Thank you for that, Molly. Last question. I know as we record in late April, HCPA's mid-year meeting is coming up, May 11th through May 14 here in Washington, D.C. What's on the agenda? What are your big topics this year?
Ooh, there's so much on the agenda. I don't even
I know.
don't even know where to start. So on the federal side, we have our usual like TSCA and PREA activity. TSCA will certainly be Toxic Substance Control Act, our federal chemical law. I think that will be a topic ripe for a discussion, depending on action in Congress. We're also running a bill to formally authorize and fund EPA's Safer Choice Program. That's a voluntary certification program that recognizes and promotes products that are made with safer ingredients. And so we'll be talking about the latest on that and sharing the status of the bill at that point in time. And we'll have Doug Troutman, EPA's Assistant Administrator for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution
Wonderful.
Prevention, speaking as well. So lots of stuff on the federal side, lots of stuff on the state side. We'll have 2 different EPR sessions, one kind of thinking about future focus, what might be the upcoming retailer expectations down the line? What might be the outcomes of this lawsuit, and what can companies do to prepare for those uncertain futures? And then one that's really talking about global compliance. There's all this activity in the EU that we didn't even talk
No, we
about.
didn't even talk about, right.
Yeah. But companies that sell globally have to deal with that right along with the US EPR states. So how do you think about finding synergies and preparing for these similar but also very different policies?
Yep.
Um, we have a fragrance demo that we're running with our air care and cleaning products division to highlight the relationship between exposure and odor threshold. And then, perhaps for most relevant for this session, this group of listeners, we're doing 2 different professional development skill building sessions, and one of them is going to feature the Product Stewardship Society. So, for those who are interested in learning more about product stewardship and how to incorporate that within our industry or within their company, we think that session is going to be a really good one for them to get a feel for PSS and learn from some experts there, and hear too about how it's being done in practice in businesses today.
Yeah, I was so pleased to see that on the agenda. That's such a great idea.
And I'll say one more plug for our other skill building session, which is on AI for regulatory professionals. We certainly hear a lot about AI all the time. I'm shocked that it didn't come up until right now, but
Right.
glad to hear it too. But when misused or when not done with proper guardrails, that can give you some very weird answers that might leave you in a place of noncompliance. So how do we train our industry to be thinking about these things?
That sounds like a wonderful agenda. No wonder it's spread over 3 days. I urge all of our listeners to take a look at the agenda because these are the hot button issues of our time, and you're hitting all of them. In the interest of full disclosure, we are a member of HCPA. I think you and your team, Molly, do a fantastic job of educating members. You're very responsive to the inquiries that I know our team raises with you. Super helpful, very, very knowledgeable. You've been a fabulous guest. We've learned a lot. I want to thank you for, number one, your professional contributions to this space. You're very good at your job, and you do a fabulous job managing product stewardship and sustainability for HCPA, and we're delighted we've been able to spend some time with you today. So thank you.
Lynn, thank you so much. It's been an honor to be on this podcast with you, and you are always um, set such a high standard for the rest of us to follow. So thank you so much for having me here today and for spending some time.
Well, we'll make that international program next on our list later in the year. Thank you, Molly.
Thanks.
Thanks again to Molly for sharing her many insights on evolving EPR programs, shifting regulatory paradigms relating to what products and packaging can be considered recyclable, and all the really good work HCPA is doing in the product stewardship space. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.